It's interesting to me that as much as we know in terms of our science in this day and age, apparently there's very little definitive knowledge about what is the nature of consciousness. And I don't necessarily want to dive into that in a great deal of detail, but it occurs to me that perhaps, and I don't know if this is true or not, or if the scientists who do study consciousness would agree with this, but it seems to me that as I reflect upon myself and think about my own inner life, that one aspect of consciousness is imagination. It's interesting that we do have the ability as humans to imagine things. We can imagine scenarios independent of the reality of, if you want to think of it in terms of reality, independent of the reality of, this object-subject relationship that we seem to formulate within our dualistic thinking mind that we take to be ordinary reality. So what are the implications of this? One of the implications is that we can guide our imagination in ways that can be beneficial to us in terms of our spiritual path. And getting down more to a nitty-gritty level, as far as what I want to communicate in this regard is, and this isn't an original thought with me. I mean, I've heard it come out of the mouth of different preachers of different traditions within Buddhism, is that within all of the Buddha sutras or scriptures, the very beginning of the scriptures very often describe the assembly. In other words, they describe the types of beings that are surrounding the Buddha, often in great detail and often also citing particular names or at least particular subtypes of individuals who are in the assembly. And again, the thing that I've heard from different Dharma teachers, Dharma masters, is that there's benefit in me, speaking for myself, imagining myself as being in the assembly. And I think that's a cool kind of idea and can be, again, very beneficial. Because just to take a sidebar, within Jodo Shinshu or Shin Buddhism, that's the tradition I relate to primarily, is that we say, well, we don't have any practices. We don't exercise self-practice, or at least we don't exercise self-power practices for the purpose of attaining enlightenment. In other words, we recognize our limitations and that the depth of those limitations is such that it's impossible, and again, just speaking for myself, impossible for me to attain Buddhahood in this life through any self-power practices. So what am I to do then? Well, what is taught in Shin Buddhism is that what I'm to do is to listen, to hear. And of course, what I'm to hear is the Dharma, the teaching. Now, if you want to call that a practice, we can call it a practice. But the point is, if my practice within my tradition, and I would argue that this should be a practice within all Buddhist traditions, is to hear the Dharma, well, where can I best hear the Dharma? I can hear it in the assembly of the Buddha. And so imagining myself as being in the assembly as these sutras are being taught is a very kind of powerful technique for immersing myself. You've heard me talk over and over about the Lotus Sutra, for example. And, what I've said about it is that, and again, this is speaking from my own experience from when I really got into it in depth, back when I had my first spiritual awakening back in 1979, is that I dwelled upon the text. I not just studied the text, not just analyzed it, but I really immersed myself in it. And I can only describe it that way, that it wasn't like an explicit, well, I'm now this person within the text. It's not exactly concrete and detailed like that, but it's more like this somehow, I can relate to it. It's speaking to me. I can hear what the message is that's being communicated, and it resonates with me in my heart. Well, just to make this point, I've got my favorite translation of the Lotus Sutra here, which is the BDK version. I've got many translations of it, and I've also talked with Dharma friends about their views on different translations, and I've also tried to search on YouTube and on various Reddit sites and other kinds of online forums to get other people's opinions. And different ones have different pros and cons, and that's a whole nother story, and maybe I can do a video on that sometime, although I don't really like the idea of speaking negatively about any particular translation, because they all have many merits, but this BDK version is quite outstanding. But again, that's not my point here. My point is just to say, in the introduction, and again, all sutras start with, well, that's interesting, all sutras start with, "Thus have I heard." And of course, that's supposed to be Ananda, Buddha's sidekick, so to speak, one of his primary disciples, who supposedly had a great memory and is the guy who sort of remembered all the detail on these things and therefore can communicate them to us. But it's interesting that in that little 4-word sentence, which starts every sutra, and I hadn't thought about this until I started doing this video, he says, "Thus have I heard." So he himself is using hearing in order to take in and participate in this grand assembly of the Buddha. Of course, it says where the Buddha is staying on this particular mountain and who's there. Well, you have a great assembly of 12,000 monks, all of whom were arhats, and it gives the author a chance then to describe what are the attributes of these arhats, and to, again, indicate the names of several of them, several of the most prominent ones, as well as some of the nuns who were there, including their attendants, 6,000 attendants. There were also, and of course these are the creme de la creme, if you will, of the assembly, there were 80,000 bodhisattva mahasattvas, all of whom were irreversible from highest complete enlightenment, or anuttara samyak sambodhi. And he gets into all the positive attributes of those bodhisattvas. And if you'll recall, in the, which sutra was it? Where, I think it was in the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, where the Buddha indicates that that's what he does. Oh no, it's in the Diamond Sutra, where he says his whole thing is to teach bodhisattvas. Big emphasis on bodhisattvas, obviously, throughout Mahayana Buddhism. But anyhow, there are 80,000 of them. Who else is there? There's the king of the Devas, he's named, along with his 20,000 attendants. There's the various Brahma lords, and also Naga kings and all of their attendants. Each was surrounded by several hundreds of thousands of attendants. And then there were the kings of the Kimnaras, and he named some of those, along with their various attendants. Also the king of the Gandharvas, all these different types of beings. And there were kings of the Asuras, and they get named. And the kings of the Garudas, all these are different types of beings. In other words, it's not just human beings. Well, what about us? What about us lay humans, us guys and gals who are not arhats or bodhisattvas, or are not one of these various subtypes of species that we would have to look them up in a Buddhist dictionary to find out exactly what they are, but not to worry, here we are. It says, at that time the Bhagavat, which is the Buddha, was respectfully surrounded by a fourfold assembly. Now, when it talks about a fourfold assembly in these Buddhist sutras, it's talking about monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. So I, as a layman, would be among the assembled, and could relate to what I'm hearing from that vantage point. And that what these four groups did was they paid homage, honored, and praised the Buddha. And just to go on a little bit with the teaching within the sutra, and I shouldn't do it because it's getting off track from my main point, but basically I have to share that what the Buddha then did once this assembly was gathered is he taught the Mahayana Sutra called Immeasurable Meanings, the instruction for the Bodhisattvas, and the treasured lore of the Buddhas. And I'll tell you what, I really do recommend that you get a copy of the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. It is wonderful. Chapter 2 of that sutra. That's where the Bodhisattvas ask, well, how should we go about this task that you're charging us to do in terms of going about helping beings? And how should we think about it? It's similar to the Diamond Sutra, where they're asking, how should our minds abide? But anyhow, the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings actually is a sutra that precedes the Lotus Sutra itself. So when you see copies of the Threefold Lotus Sutra, that volume will include the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings at the beginning, and then after the Lotus Sutra, it'll include the sutra on the contemplation of the Bodhisattva called Samantabhadra, or Universal Virtue. He's the one that protects people that focus their protection on the Lotus Sutra itself. He's the one that rides on the white elephant and represents action. So anyhow, within the first chapter of the Lotus Sutra, it's talking about how the Buddha taught the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, or it's called here Immeasurable Meanings. After having taught this sutra, the Buddha sat cross-legged, entered the samadhi called the abode of immeasurable meanings, and remained unmoving in both body and mind. And then what happens? A miracle. Mandarava and great Mandarava flowers, Manjusaka and great Manjusaka flowers, then fell like rain from the sky, scattering upon the Buddha and all of his attendants. And the whole Buddha world quaked in 6 ways. At that time, the whole assembly, remember that's us, the whole assembly of humans and non-humans, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, the devas, nagas, yakshas, gandharvas, asuras, garudas, kimnaras, maharagas, kings and noble emperors, having experienced something unprecedented, were filled with joy. And with their palms pressed together, they gazed attentively at the Buddha. And then, of course, the Buddha emitted a ray of light from the tuft of white hair between his eyebrows. It illuminated all the 18,000 worlds in the east, down as far as the lowest hell, Avicii, and up as high as the Akanistha heaven. And, of course, then it describes this light and how it shines on all the various worlds. And it then gets into the question of, what is this about? What is he doing, and why is he doing it? So as we in the assembly are awed by these events and surrounded ourselves by all these groups of various types, well, it's kind of cool. I mean, we can really use our imagination, and that's okay to do, because, again, is imagination not a key aspect of consciousness? And if that aspect of consciousness can help us, not by developing some kind of sort of delusional idea of the idea that, well, I'm really sitting there, looking at the Buddha who's up on this mountain, but recognizing that it is imagination, and that through it, teachings can come to us through the parables that are being taught by the Buddha, that can be more effective in some ways than straight teaching of, this is the doctrine, this is the doctrine, this is how the doctrine works. Although that too is beneficial, and we do find that in places like, for example, the Awakening of Faith Shastra, or the Lankavatara Sutra. But these scriptures that are more embedded within a kind of a metaphorical, mythopoetic is what I call it, framework, have great benefit. And so I recommend that you open yourselves up, open your heart up, open your mind up to the idea of sort of joining in and considering yourself part of the great assembly surrounding the Buddha and hearing his teaching, the great Buddha Dharma. Namandavs, namandavs, namandavs.